Alberta Premier Danielle Smith plans to challenge Ottawa's requirement to achieve a net zero electricity grid by 2035. The feds introduced draft regulations that spell that target out in the summer. The final regulations are expected in the middle of next year. The Alberta government has already pushed back on that timeline, suggesting 2050 is more realistic and that any sooner could put the province's grid at risk of failure during peak periods. Now the province is taking its opposition a step further, invoking the Sovereignty Act just moments ago in the provincial legislature for the first time. Premier Danielle Smith is here with us live to talk about that. Premier, good to have you back on the program. Thank you for making the time.
Hi, you bet.
I have a few questions about how this will all work, but I wanted to start with the why. In particular, the last time we spoke, you said you would use this act only really as a measure of last resort. What about this situation is last resort? It's draft regulations. Nothing will be final until the middle of next year. Your bureaucrats and the federal government's bureaucrats are still talking. Why are you pulling this lever now?
Well, we're not making enough progress on trying to bring the federal government in alignment with our strategy, which is to be carbon neutral by 2050. In fact, everything that we have seen suggests that they're just simply ignoring the Supreme Court that came down and said that the federal government cannot use an area of their jurisdiction as a pretext to invade ours. And yet they continue to persist. And so we know that the danger that we have in this province is that we need to build more baseload power. In this province, it comes from natural gas. We don't have any generators willing to step up with the uncertainty the federal government has created. And that's why we need to step in.
I just want to unpack that answer for a little bit. So your assessment is that things aren't moving fast enough. But again, I'm going to put to you, Premier, the deadline or the imposition of final regulations aren't going to happen until the middle of next year. You've got at least 6 months. What are you basing your assessment on that they're not as in line with what you want as possible? They have, Minister Boissonnault was talking to me a few weeks ago in question period. He did not rule out a carve out for Alberta in this instance.
Well, I can tell you that we're not making progress at the table. I mean, I told the Prime Minister from the very first day I spoke with him that we wanted to have a 2050 target. I asked him to wait for my emissions reduction and energy development plan to be released. He did. We asked them not to come forward with these gazetted regs. And if they did, to give a carve out to Alberta, they refused. We've been having joint discussions every couple of weeks, and we're not seeing anywhere near the progress that we need. They're not aligning around our 2050 target. They're not accepting the reality of where we find ourselves in Alberta. And as a result, we have to take matters into our own hands. I know that in other jurisdictions, they've got a supply of hydroelectric power. Others have a supply of nuclear power. We don't have either of those. Our baseload power has always been on natural gas and is going to be for decades to come, which is why since the federal government doesn't seem to be prepared to recognize how essential that is, we have to take steps so that we can start getting some of those projects in the queue now.
So has the federal government, to be blunt, said to you there is no way we will extend that timeline when the final regulations come out to 2050? Because a statement that they provided over the weekend said that the government of Alberta has never brought up a constitutional veto at the negotiating table. Our government is ready to continue making substantial investments in Alberta's electricity infrastructure with a cooperative partner, and our regulations are designed with many flexibilities to ensure they are realistic and accommodate Alberta's needs.
They are neither. I mean, when they're talking about having natural gas be abated 95% by 2035, that technology just simply doesn't exist. And if you talk to anybody who is an expert in carbon capture, we're at about 60% abatement, which is pretty good. We might be able to get to 80%, which is fantastic. But 95% at the current available technology isn't achievable. And yet the federal government is intending to use its criminal law power to terrify senior executives so that they don't end up putting forward projects in the first place. And it's worked. We don't have any baseload power proposals coming forward. And that's a real problem because we're going to have to double our use of power over the next 25 years. And it has to be baseload power. So this is the problem, is that they act as if they are working with us, and they're not. They continue to just tinker around the edges without dealing with the substantive problem that 2050 is achievable, 2035 simply is not.
Their accusation, though, Premier, with respect, is that you're actually being deliberately inflammatory and more political, particularly when you use the threat that you say they have of criminal prosecution or the imposition of criminal law. I think what you're referencing is the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, which these regulations would fall under. In the past 25 years, there have only been 2 sentences imposed on convicted offenders under that act. Both involved repeated offenses as they concerned hazardous waste. They did not involve anything in line with this. Are you being deliberately inflammatory?
All I can tell you is that when I speak with executives, they tell me that their boards of directors will not allow them to take the risk that someone is going to end up in jail in 2035 if they don't meet these unachievable targets. And so there's a very simple way of going forward together, which is to have a best efforts type of approach. And if we can do it sooner than 2050, fantastic. Some companies suggest they can. But all of the indication I am getting from all of our generators is that 2035, unfortunately, the technology is just not to a level where they can commit to that. We don't have an environment where we can bring nuclear power on stream very quickly. We've never had nuclear in this province before, so we have a lot of consultation and a brand new regulatory framework to set up. We have carbon capture utilization and storage technology that is really in its infancy. I think there's a lot of promise. We do have at scale commercial development of that, but to get to a point where it can be deployed to the level the feds want, it takes time. So I would say if they want to work with us on 2050 target, we're absolutely, that's where we've been trying to get them to at the beginning, from the very start of all of this.
And I certainly take your point, Premier, on all the arguments you're making why it might not work in Alberta. And I understand that you may feel far apart from the federal government. Why not then, as you responded earlier in the program, if you are so certain of your case as it sort of comes up or stacks up against previous Supreme Court cases, why not take this through the courts rather than essentially invoke a piece of legislation that flouts the rule of law for Alberta?
Oh, far from it. The federal government is flouting the rule of law. They have now lost 2 court cases, and they've lost them because they continue to overreach in our jurisdiction. Then they make us go to court for years at great expense, while everything is frozen in the private sector, to try to get our rights back. We're not going to do that. We can't afford to do that this time. I can't afford to wait 4 or 5 or 10 years for the Supreme Court to ultimately come down on our side, as I believe they will. The federal government has to stop acting in a lawless way. They have been given an admonishment twice that this is not what cooperative federalism looks like. They cannot use their jurisdiction to trample on ours. And we remain at the table. I think we can work with them on developing a framework for small modular nuclear. We can develop a framework around hydrogen. And I think we can develop a framework around carbon capture. But we are not going to be bullied into giving up our jurisdiction. They have no right to be dictating to us. And we would ask for them to continue to work cooperatively with us, because I think we can.
And once again, I do understand the points that you're making, but in this country generally, when we oppose something that is legally binding on us, we go to court to oppose it. We don't just say, you know what, it doesn't apply to us. And that does set a precedent. If I'm paying taxes in Alberta and I don't like them anymore, am I all of a sudden just not going to have to pay them?
Well, I would say this is, if you look at the structure of the Sovereignty Act today, we are asserting our jurisdiction under Section 92, which gives us the exclusive right to develop our electricity grid. If they want to override our law, then they can do so, but then it will ultimately end up in the court. But we're getting there first. We're saying that we have the right to develop our power grid. We are going to develop our power grid. We are not going to allow for a problem with reliability or affordability. We're not going to allow our power grid to fail. We're going to keep on building. And if they want to take us to court, I suppose that's ultimately where it will end up. But I feel pretty confident that we're on the right side on this, and they are not. And I would ask for them to, once again, work with us to try to get to a target that we can both agree on.
Do you think you're creating a climate right now, though, where the federal government will want to work with you? I mean, you've gone to 100 6 months before the final regulations are even released.
Actually, I look at it the exact opposite way. They have provoked us. They have come through with policy suggesting they're going to take away our ability to regulate our own power grid. They want to put in aggressive targets on an emissions cap. They want to put an aggressive target on a methane cap. They threaten to bring in aggressive targets on fertilizer. They've threatened to take away our ability to manage our building codes in building net zero homes. They have threatened to not allow for combustion engine vehicles to be on the road after 2035. They're the ones being provocative. Because we're responding to them in our area of jurisdiction, we are just defending Albertans. I think they should stop being provocative, stop acting in a lawless way, respect the law, respect the Constitution, respect the Supreme Court. And then we won't have to have this kind of uncomfortable conversation.
With great respect, Premier, the other way to look at it is, though, that they, along with the U.S. and other G7 countries, all of whom have set the same target, are trying to mitigate the impacts of climate change. And drastic measures are needed. They've not said, do it and we wash our hands. They've said, here's $40 billion, for example, we'll put on the table to help get provinces to that place. I take your points about why it's going to be difficult for Alberta, but the goal with which they're approaching this with is to mitigate the impacts of climate change, which also end up costing Albertans a lot.
This is why we are in sync on a 2050 target. We take it seriously. We know we have to do emissions reduction. China has a target of 2060. India has a target of 2070. I think that in Alberta and in Canada, we can develop the technology that will ultimately help China and India to reach those targets. But we won't do it if we end up shutting down the Alberta economy. The kind of proposals that they're putting forward are a recipe for unaffordable energy, unreliable power grid, which will only chase investment away. And I just simply can't allow that.
Just finally, Premier, though, if I recall, it's the person who, your predecessor, former Premier Kenney, who actually said your crafting and now use, I would imagine, of the Sovereignty Act in and of itself threatens to make investment from Alberta flee. I believe he said, we'll ignore the Constitution, we'll choose which laws we enforce. Well, what investor in their right mind would put money at risk in Alberta?
Well, I would invite anyone to look at what we put forward today. It underscores Section 92 with our jurisdiction. It relies on our constitutional rights. It underscores the Supreme Court decision that recently came down, which admonished the federal government. And it looks at a very practical way in which we can get our power grid going again and get investment going again. We have to remember that what has happened here is the federal government's invading our jurisdiction, creating uncertainty, has caused investment to flee. I have no projects lined up to build baseload power of natural gas. And it's because of the uncertainty the federal government has created. We're about to restore certainty. We're telling the industry, we want to work with you to build more baseload natural gas. Tell us how we can do it, because we want to make sure that we continue to keep up with growth. So I think we're going to actually improve the investment climate in our province.
Okay, Premier, I'm out of time. I'll leave it there. I appreciate your time as always. Thank you.
Thanks, Vassy.